Hello, I am Helge Lang Petersen. I am from the IOF Foot Orienteering Commission. It is my pleasure to share with you this presentation. I hope it will inspire future course setters and event advisors to deliver even greater sprint courses in the future. 2022 was a great year for sprint orienteering. The pictures shows a few snapshots from some of our high-level events. In May, we had the first World Cup round in Borås, Sweden, with 3 exciting sprint competitions. In the picture, the king of knockout sprint in 2022, Mathias Kiburs, crosses the finish line. In June, we had the first ever sprint orienteering championships in the triangle area of Denmark. In the picture, you see the arena crossing in the sprint final in Vejle. And in July, we had the sprint competitions of the Junior World Orienteering Championships in Agueda Beira, Portugal. The picture shows the first ever Junior World Championship in sprint relay, Norway, with Pia Young-Vik in the last leg. In 2022, we also had sprint competitions in other high-level events, such as the World Games in USA, World Masters Orienteering Championships in Italy, and the European Youth Orienteering Championships in Hungary. In 2022, we had several competitions in each of the 3 sprint formats: sprint, sprint relay, and knockout sprint. We now see athletes that specialize in the new knockout sprint format, and other athletes who master all 3 formats. In the same way, we start to see 3 sprint formats developing their own characteristics. This presentation will first have a section on sprint, then a few considerations about what sprint relay and knockout sprint has in common, and finally we go into further details, first with sprint relay and then finally the knockout sprint. In all cases, we will use examples from high-level events in 2022. So let us start with the sprint format. Sprint is an individual start format, which means that the athletes start according to a start list, usually with 1-minute start interval. This means that the athletes can fully focus on their own execution. The courses can have large complexity in route choices and also challenge athletes with complexity in leg execution. A great course will challenge the athletes to their maximum capacity all the way through. Typically, a great sprint course is a mix of longer challenging route choice legs with complex execution and shorter legs. It's okay to have route choices going back out from the control the same way you came in. Let us take a look at the men's final course at the World Orienteering Championships in 2022 to see how these principles were applied. In the picture, you can see an overview of the course. The course was set in the center of the city of Vejle. Like most courses, it consisted of a first part, an arena passing in the park where the arena was placed, and then a second part, as can be seen in the slide. Now let us take a closer look at part 1 of the men's course. It started with a really short leg to control number 1, then a long route choice leg going towards control number 2, then a series of really short legs going from control number 2 until control number 8, and then another long route choice leg going down to control number 9. We now focus on the long leg from control number 1 to control number 2. This leg was used in both the men's and the women's course. The questions to ask is if the route choice challenge was adequately difficult and if the complexity in execution was adequate. Take a look and let us take a look at the route choices that the athletes actually took afterwards. The leg had a lot of possible route choices. We have shown the 4 that was used by most of the athletes. Green is the shortest, but it is not easy to see and not easy to execute in the backyards in the middle of the leg, as you can see here. But those who were successful in execution, they had the best times. But also, this leg was the one that challenged Tove Alexandersson from Sweden and eventually meant that she did not take another win. Blue is the second best and was taken by many athletes. Execution is easier in the start, but then there is a complex section running through the city's pedestrian street area, going like this. What is interesting is that the men's bronze medal winner, Yannick Michels, took the red route choice, which is 120 meters longer than the green. Michels is famous for his extreme running capacity, and still he was only 11 seconds behind at the first TV split after less than 5 minutes of running. This shows that different athletes would also in sprint use different tactics. Some take short routes that are complex to execute, others take long and more simple routes. Now we look at the second part of the course. We have the arena passing, and after the arena passing there was a map change. Then there was a short loop going down to the second start triangle, starting with a really tricky leg going into this control number 11. And then you had route choice legs going to control number 12, 13 and 14. Then there was a very simple part of the course. This is where we had the TV section in part 2, going up to a control here in the park. Then a route choice leg going towards control number 19, more simple vector 20, another route choice leg, and then the last leg going into the arena and the finish. We now focus at the route choice leg after the park. In the men's course it was 18 to 19, and in the women's course it was 15 to 16. The picture shows a section for the women's course. As mentioned, the leg followed the TV section in controls 12 to 15. So the legs 12 to 15 were quite simple to execute, but then 15 to 16 was intended to be another decisive route choice leg, and indeed it was. Now take a look at the leg and decide what route you would like to take. The leg had 4 route choices. The alert would discover that going right north from control 15, following the green route choice, they will get a short and smooth route into control number 16. This route choice was part of the reason why Gustav Bergman of Sweden took another World Championship medal in this race. The majority of the athletes took the blue route choice. It's also fast, but it is slightly longer. Not very many took the purple route choice, but a few actually did take the red route choice. And several athletes were severely challenged in the execution in this corner down here, and it also was a longer route choice, which means that it was quite decisive if you took that route choice. Now let us leave the World Orienteering Championships for a while and go to the sprint final in the World Cup in Borås in May. This was a completely different type of terrain. Where the JWOC final was in a city centre, the race in Borås was in the suburbs. As you can see from the map, the area consisted of residential building blocks surrounded by park areas. In this kind of area, the visibility is much better than in a city centre and thus allows for another type of orienteering where the athlete will to a much larger degree look ahead to see buildings they are going to pass on their way to the controls. Let us take a closer look at one of the route choice legs in the last part of the course, the leg 15-16 in the men's course. The challenge here is not to get stuck behind a fence, a hedge, or another area that you are not allowed to cross. There were 3 route choices where green and blue were very similar. Green and blue had some difficulties in execution. In the last part of the blue course, the athletes would probably use the big building as their navigation point. When approaching the control in the green course, the athletes would take advantage of the good visibility in the football field just before the control. The red route choice is a bit longer but easier in execution and allowing more time to study entry to the next control after control number 16, and maybe even have time to turn the map to see the leg after the map flip at control number 17. Now we take another big jump to the sprint competition of the World Games in USA. The terrain was here quite similar to Borås. However, in this case, the race was held in a university campus. But the navigation challenge was similar. Make sure not to get stuck, and this time behind walls or in front of olive green areas, and then navigate using the big buildings. As can be seen from the map sample, the area was quite hilly, and thus an additional dimension was added to the route choice considerations, not to climb more than necessary and avoid steep descents if possible. Now let's take a closer look at the leg from control number 10 to control number 11. There were 3 route choices. Green and blue lift the control towards the park and then red towards the road. It's always great that the athlete has to decide the route choice before actually leaving the control. In all route choices, the actual athletes will navigate using the buildings and be careful to understand where they can pass the walls and around the olive green areas. In this case, the control is on a slope, so the athletes would be careful not to take the control from the bottom, but rather from the top, so they would not have to climb back up towards the control. Since green is the shortest, it's most likely also the fastest. But the walls that you have here make it a little difficult in execution to make sure that you find the right way. Note that if you take the blue route choice, it's important to stay up here, since when you go down here, then you have to go down and go back up towards control number 11. So a quite tricky route choice leg where you really have to be very, very careful. The last example of a great sprint leg in 2022 is found at the Junior World Orienteering Championships in Aguirre de Beira, Portugal in July. As those of you who have been doing sprint orienteering in Southern Europe knows, here are a lot of small towns with narrow streets that allows for complex sprint orienteering. And the town of Carapito, chosen for the sprint in these championships, was exactly that. It should be noted that the town was rather small and that an old sprint map was available to the athletes from years before. Thus, they had a chance to be well prepared. We take a look at the leg from start to control number 1. It's an immense course. As can be seen from the map, the athletes had 90 meters from the map handout until they had to decide their route choice to control number 1. This was a way for the course setter to challenge the athletes from the very start of the course. Now take a short look at the questions and then let us take a look at what actually happened. Now let us take a look at the route choices. There are actually more or less 6 of them. Let's start out by purple, which is short, but then you need to run on grass, and then you need to be careful to find the right passage here in the last part of the course. Orange is also quite short, but it has relatively complex navigation in the bare rocks, and then you have to find your way when you get down into the town. Brown was taken by quite many, but it was longer and gave a tough climb back up to the control. On the other hand, it was easier to execute. Blue and red probably were both a bit too long. But all in all, this was a really challenging start of a sprint course. But then, let us discuss if it was fair to have a challenging route choice leg after just 90 meters of running. Was the risk too high that the athletes would just pick a random route choice, and thus it would not be fair who was lucky to pick the right one? Well, we felt that the athletes were able to be prepared since they had the old map, and if this had been a totally new area with no map available, probably we would have made the distance from map handout to start triangle longer. Finally, what about route choices passing a grass slope and a bare rock? In general, we try to avoid forest-like terrain in sprint competitions in order to make the sprint format challenges significantly different from forest formats. But in this case, the grass was cut and the area was easy runnable. And finally, it was possible to take route choices around these areas. You can see one of the athletes running on the bare rock in the picture here. So our final conclusion was that we found this was, in this case, a good way to solve a route choice. Now, speaking about sections with forest orienteering in sprint, we now look at the last part of the sprint course at the Junior World Orienteering Championships in Portugal. It was set in the forest since it was the only way to get the courses to the arena location. Sprint formats should, as mentioned before, be significantly different from forest competition formats. Thus, it is not the intention to have complex forest orienteering in sprint courses. As can be seen from the map sample showing the end of the courses, the controls in the forest were deliberately made really simple. Control 17 is placed next to a significant track. Control 18 is placed in a very visible location right next to a big building, and the last control in the football field is easy accessible following the tape. However, as you can see from the picture taken from the northeast of Control 18, not all athletes took the easy way to control number 19. Now, let us change focus to the two other sprint formats, sprint relay and knockout sprint. They are both mass start formats, and mass start formats are characterized by a high level of stress with the athletes and thus a small willingness to take risks. Thus, it is acceptable to have lower complexity in route choice and execution in these formats than the sprint format with individual start. However, we still want the athletes to be challenged in their map reading skills. The sprint relay consists of 4 legs, each with a winning time of 12 to 15 minutes. A key point of attention for course setting is that the athletes will form a line, so it's important not to place controls in such a way that athletes leaving the control block the way for those who are coming into the control. When you look at the picture, you may wonder why we have so many men together in the picture, as the men usually do not run first leg in sprint relay formats. Well, this is because the picture is from the urban relay in Portugal this summer, where 3 junior men formed a men's team, and likewise with the women. The picture is from the first leg of the men's relay and shows how the athletes are really disciplined in not blocking the way for the athletes coming from behind. But imagine what would have happened if the athletes would have had a narrow alley going into the control and then would have had to go the same way out. Now, let us look at some parts of sprint relay courses in 2022. We are back in the World Cup in Borås in Sweden. The sprint relay came through the city center. The leg from control 9 to 10 shows how an apparently not so interesting city area can still have decisive legs with the use of a few artificial barriers. The picture shows athletes entering control 9 from the south, and you can see athletes carefully studying their map in order to find the right route choice. So, let us once again look at the leg to study route choice options and complexity in execution. So, let us take a look at the possible route choices. On the green route, the second bridge across the river is used, and this is clearly the fastest. However, surprisingly, many athletes appear to be reluctant to stay on that side of the river and so chose the blue route choice, going like this. And a few athletes even took the significantly longer red route choice, and it did turn out that this leg was quite decisive. When the route choices has been selected, the routes are relatively simple to execute. It's okay to have this kind of leg in a relay to make it more difficult for followers to catch up with the leaders. Now we look at the last leg of the sprint relay in the Borås World Cup. This is where the relay may be decided, so the question is if such a leg is adequate to decide a relay. There are two route choices. Blue and red are quite similar in length, and they are both quite easy to see on the map, and they are both quite simple to execute. This is a good way to aim for excitement in the end of a relay. If one team is a few meters ahead, the following team may choose the other route in order to maybe just get ahead. If, for example, the leading athlete would have taken the red route, going like this, then the follower could take blue, and if she was just those meters faster, then it could be decisive. Also, coming from the blue route gives a better angle in passing the control. You can pass at full speed and have a better starting point in running up the stairs towards the finish line. In the actual event, this did not matter though, since Sweden was far ahead and Caroline Olsson could jog towards the finish line together with her teammates. In the same sprint relay, another situation was found that illustrates how careful you need to be when you have multiple levels in a sprint terrain. While running towards the second control, one route choice passed a parking roof. This is the parking roof. But it also shows there is an entry to a lower parking depth from street level. You can see this entry in the picture, and you can see the entry to the parking deck on the top going up here. If nothing was done, there would have been a risk that the athletes would have confused the street level entry with the roof entry. If this had happened, the athletes would have come out from the lower parking level and right into this out of bounds area, going in here below the deck and coming out here, and thus would have been disqualified. On the day, this problem was solved by taping the entry to the lower parking deck and having guards placed there to move the tape if cars had to go out or in of the parking area. More such challenges will be shown in the presentation about rules interpretation in another meeting. But let us now get back to sprint relays. We are 1 month later compared to the World Cup in Borås. We are in Kolding in Denmark on the 26th of June, and we are having the sprint relay in the World Orienteering Championships. We are looking at the leg 9 to 10 that is found just after the athletes had been passing the arena. This means that the athlete had just around 2 minutes of running along mandatory routes before they have to pick the route choice for control number 10. As can be seen, the course setters had chosen to have a forking at the end of this long and quite complex leg. Now take a look at the leg and think of what you would do as a route choice. Now let us take a look at the route choices. We have divided the picture in two, the upper one showing the route choices to the forking 10A and the lower one showing the route choices for the forking 10B. So we start with the top of the map showing the most likely route choices to forking 10A. The two most likely routes will both approach the control from the north. The red and green routes are very similar in length and thus also in time. But know the point shown with a red arrow. Here athletes had to turn back to go north in the backyard to take the red route. This is a hard decision to take when you run in a group with the rest continuing towards the south. Now we look at the lower map with the most likely route choices coming into the control from the south. This was a great way to force the athletes to make their own route choice. At the same time, all the routes were quite equal in length, so that athletes were not set back only because of what forking they were going to. Finally, all routes had average complexity in execution, which is good for a sprint relay. We now look at another leg in the same sprint relay that also turned out to be decisive. It is a leg in the men's course only from control number 12 to control number 13. However, the key reason for this decisiveness was not about the route choice, but rather about the execution. This will be further covered in the rules interpretation presentation. But let us go back to the route choice options. Take a close look to see what you would do. Now, let us take a look at the route choices. There are a lot of them. Blue and yellow leave the control the same way you come in and go like this. Green and red follow a small track along the railroad. Then at the second part, blue and yellow will have different routes. Blue will continue up here, coming from the north. Yellow will follow along the river. And then you also have alternatives going south of the river, maybe all the way down here and coming back up to the control. Note the red arrow here, showing that all the route choices will actually meet in this point, meaning that there will be more route choice combinations than those that are shown on the map. The green route choice was chosen by most athletes. Blue and red were probably seen as being too far from the direct line. But interestingly, Gustav Bergman in the lead of the relay was one of the few athletes that actually chose the blue route. It's possible that the different route choices were difficult for the athletes to find, and those they chose to stay in the group to quite a large extent. Like was the case in Borås, we now look at the last route choice leg of the sprint relay of the World Orienteering Championships. This leg was used by both the men and the women. After control 16, they just had to punch 17 and run up the stairs towards the finish line. Like in Borås' case, we asked the question if this was an adequate leg to decide the relay. Take a look and consider what you think. Here are the route choices. The red one is the shortest, but also has more turns than the blue one. Green has two variants, but it's actually so much longer than it could be decisive if someone took this in the end of the course. I have to admit that I was surprised here. I was briefing the commentators before the race, and I was so sure that green was too long that I did not even present this route to them. Then in the second leg, Max Peter Beimer in the leading Swedish team actually took the green route choice, and the majority of the other teams in the second leg did as well. In third leg, all athletes took red. In fourth leg, which of course was the last one, there was a fierce fight for the bronze medal between 4 teams. They all took the green route choice. If one had taken red, this could have decided the bronze medal. The conclusion is that athletes are reluctant to take different routes in the end of a sprint relay, but again, it was great work from the course setters to make this possible. Now, let us get back to the Junior World Orienteering Championships in Portugal. You will know this area from before, but now we are having the sprint relay instead of having the individual sprint. You may remember from earlier on that the arena location was decisive for the courses. Thus, the sprint relay both started and ended in the forest. The first controls were placed in a part of the forest with great visibility in order not to make the first controls decisive. 59 was the forking A of the first control, and 75 is the forking B of the first control. Note that there are several route choices going out from the first controls in both situations. The picture shows the athletes punching at the first control of the A forking that you just saw in the map before. It was a fantastic view to see all the first leg runners passing the control. And you can also see one advantage of actually starting a sprint relay in a forest, or the same would maybe be possible in a park area, that you have plenty of space around the control, which means that even with 53 teams on the start line, there was no crowding at the controls. So now let us take a look at the route choice options. There are 3 different possible route choices shown as red, blue, and green in the slide. You can see that all of the route choices can be taken from both the forkings. Green is the shortest from both the forked controls, but it has a bit more climb than red. Probably when you are at the B control, you may be reluctant to run down the slope, so instead you probably like to stay up. Blue is kind of a trap. It's really easy to find the entry to the blue route when you leave the forest, but when you get to the roads in the town, blue is longer and has a much tougher climb than green. So let's take a look at the tracking from the event to see what actually happened. In the picture, you can see in the GPS tracking what happened. The GPS tracking is stopped at the time the first athlete actually came to control number 2. You can see from the tracking that those who took the green route choice, they are already now at control number 2. You can also see that those who took the red route choice, they are close, but they are not yet at the control. They are here at the moment. Also, those who took the blue route choice, they actually only came to this point here, which means that they are further behind at this time. So this was a really decisive route choice leg, a really great work from the course setter's side. And it also points out that as an athlete, you always need to be really careful early in a sprint relay, since the route choices may not be as easy to pick as you think from the first glance. We now leave the sprint relay and turn towards the knockout sprint. What you need to be aware of is that when the competition time in a sprint relay is approximately 1 hour, it is 6 to 8 minutes in the elimination rounds and final of the knockout sprint. Thus, even small details like a parked car in a wrong place can have a huge impact. Athlete safety is an extremely important point of attention in knockout sprint. In general, there should be no vehicle traffic when sprint competitions are going on, but in the elimination rounds and final of a knockout sprint, this is even more important. The athletes are simply not giving attention to traffic rules. If there is traffic in the area, you need to have plenty of guards to look after traffic. But before we start, let us do a short recap of the knockout sprint format. Knockout sprint usually consists of 4 races: a qualification race, a quarterfinal, a semifinal, and a final. The quarterfinal and semifinal we usually call the elimination rounds. The total number of athletes before we start, in this case we say it's X, and then in the qualification races we bring down the total number of athletes to 36. In the quarterfinal we bring down the total number to 18, and the semifinal for 6 athletes that then will go on to race in the final medal race. In each heat there will be 1/3 of the total number in the qualification, since we usually have 3 qualification heats. And then when we get to the quarterfinals, we have 36 athletes. 6 athletes in each heat means that we will have 6 quarterfinal heats. From the quarterfinals, we will still have 6 athletes in the semifinal, and we will also have 6 athletes in each heat of the final. Then how many will qualify from each heat? Well, as mentioned, we have 12 times 3 means 36 athletes qualifying, so that gives 12 athletes qualifying from each qualification heat. To get from 36 to 18, then the 3 best athletes in the quarterfinals will qualify for the semifinals. Then we have 18 back and we have 3 semifinals, which means that from each of the 3 semifinals, we will have 2 athletes going on towards the final. Since there is a mass start in both the elimination rounds and in the final, a big question in knockout sprint is if forking should be used. The possibilities are to use what we call a diamond forking, to use runner's choice, and to use no forking. The diamond forking was not used in 2022, so we will not cover this in this presentation. But we are now back at the World Cup in Borås. We are at the semifinal, where the runner's choice forking model was used. So before the start, the athletes were given 20 seconds to look at the 3 different courses shown in the slide here. You can see that the controls number 2 and control number 5 are the same, but controls number 3 and 4 are different in the 3 variants. So, after 20 seconds, the athlete chose either course A, B, and C, and would then run this course when they were released for the start. Now, take a close look at the 3 courses and decide which one you would pick. Well, we actually only gave you around 10 seconds to do your choice, but I guess you got a feeling that this is really tough. We have now put the most likely route choices on the 3 sections, and you can see them shown with the red line in the 3 different course alternatives. You have A, you have B, which is more or less the same, and then you have C, which are going in a different direction. So in those 20 seconds, the athlete should identify 9 routes and decide which group of 3 they consider to be the best. Even for world-class athletes, this is a difficult task. Most likely, they would not try to find the shortest alternative, but rather pick the one that they found to be the less complex to execute, and then remember as much of the route as possible. Now, let us see what choices the world-class athletes actually made. As you remember, there are 3 semi-final heats for men and 3 for women. The first men's heat, we had 5 choosing A and 1 choosing C. In the second semi-final, we still have 5 choosing A and 1 choosing C. In the third men's heat, we had 3 choosing A and 3 choosing C. In the first women's semi-final, we had 5 choosing A and 1 choosing B. And in the second semi-final for the women, we had 5 choosing A and 1 choosing C. Notably, Tove Alexandersson was the only one to pick C in that heat. And then finally, in the last heat, we had 3 choosing A, 2 choosing B, and 1 choosing C. And of course, it should be noted that when the athletes start, they don't know what choices the other athletes have made. The yellow cover shows who eventually went to the final. Since most athletes picked A, it is no surprise that also most athletes with this alternative also made it to the final. The question is, how much of an advantage it was to be 5 in a group with only 1 being alone? Well, but the opposite may also be the case, that it could be an advantage to be alone. Actually, both Sarah Hagström and Tove Alexandersson were the only ones with their alternative, and they were both first at control 5 in their heats. In the men's heats, all athletes were more or less together after the runner's choice section. This means at control number 5. So it's hard to make a clear conclusion, but the conclusion may be that the route choices in the runner's choice part were a bit too complex for the athletes to decide from, but the use of runner's choice made the semifinals exciting for the spectators to see who would execute this runner's choice part best. Now, let us go back to the courses. We are still at the World Cup in Borås, and now we are looking at the final loop of the final of the knockout sprint. The question is if the challenges in this part of the course are suitable to decide a knockout sprint. Now, let us look at the route choices. From the start was a very easy leg towards control number 10. Then you had 3 different route choices, blue going like this, red going like this, and green going like this, from control number 10 to control number 11. And then again you had 1 route choice that was the likely only one going to control number 12, and then the last route going towards the last control and into the finish. So what actually happened? If we start by looking at the men, they actually split evenly, which means that 2 of them took 1 to another and the rest took the 3rd route choice in the final. Well, what finally happened was that Matthias Keburs won by having a higher running speed than the others in the last part of the course. In the women's final, all took the green route choice, and the final was eventually also decided by the fact that Tove Alexandersson had a higher running speed than the others. It's again hard to make a conclusion, but the feeling is that this mix between simple legs and route choice legs seem to have worked well at the end of the final here in Burros. Now, for the last time today, let us go back to the World Orienteering Championships and take a closer look at the first ever knockout sprint World Orienteering Championships. The race was held in the city of Fredericia, an old garrison town at the sea. At first glance, setting sprint courses here seemed to be a hopeless task due to a network of roads crossing each other at a 90-degree angle. But with a number of artificial barriers and a great work to have a large number of backyards opened for the race, this became a truly memorable event. In JWOC, the course setters decided not to use forkings in neither the quarterfinal, semifinal, nor the final. The ambition was to instead create difficult route choices in order to spread the runners this way. In the map, we show the leg from control 2 to 3 in the quarterfinal. The men and the women had the same quarterfinal course. Take a look at the leg and decide what you would do. Now let us take a look at the route choices that the athletes actually took. They were divided in 3 groups, so let's take a look at each of them. We have the light green route choice going back out from the control, going up here, and then going back here, and then a fast route going towards the control like this. A variant of the light green is a dark green following the same route but going this way into the control, meaning that those 2 route choices were very similar. Then we also here had the really simple route choice, which was a bit longer, the blue one going up here and all the way like this coming into the control. And then there was the southern route choice where you continue towards the south from the second control and going the red route choice like this down here and coming back up here. The course setter decided that the legs should not be very different in length, which means that regardless what leg you took, you would still take more or less the same time if you did the execution properly. So it was more important to make a choice than what choice you actually made. We had 72 athletes in the quarterfinal, 36 men and 36 women, and they, as mentioned, took each of these route choices. As you can see from the numbers, that the light green route choice was taken by 41 athletes, the green by 14, the blue by 11, and the red route was chosen by 6 athletes. Another finding is that in 10 out of the 12 heats, 5 or more athletes were running together for the entire course. This means that the athletes were reluctant to take different routes. Maybe it was difficult for the athletes to evaluate the different route choices, and thus they found it was safer to stay in the group. Maybe the running speed in this format is simply so high that the capacity of the athletes to evaluate route choices are not so large. Notably, the only 6 to take the red route choice were all in the same heat. So even though the vast majority of other athletes found light green was best, no one in that heat dared to take it when all the others took another route. We are now in the semi-final of the knockout sprint in the World Championships in Fredericia. Let's take a closer look at the leg from control number 8 to control number 9. Both men and women had this leg, only it was not 8 and 9 for the women. But if you took the right route choice in this leg, it would probably be decisive, since just after control number 9, you got to the last control and into the finish. So also, if you pick the wrong route choice, it could be equally decisive. So take a good look at the leg and decide what you would like to do. So let us take a look at the route choices. You can see there are 4 options taken by the athletes. They came into control number 8 from here, control number 7 just outside the picture. Then you have the green route choice where you continue going straight over the parking lot and going like this and into this area here, and then following a route towards the last control that they could also have followed in the semifinal. All 3 other alternatives, they would go back from control number 8, they would go back, and then the purple and blue would make a sharp turn here, also in a place where they had been before, and then the purple would go to the right, going up here, the blue would continue going this way into the control, and finally the red route choice would go like this into the control. The blue route choice is the shortest, the green and the purple are shortly longer, and then the red route choice is the longest of these route choices here. Now let's take a look at the table over here. This is where you can see the distribution of route choices taken by the athletes in the different heats. We have the 3 men's semifinal heats and we have the 3 women's semifinal heats. Note that in one of the women's semifinal heats, 2 athletes made mistakes to an extent where it made no sense to tell what route choice they take. But in all other cases, we actually have the number of athletes taking the different route choices shown here in the table. The underlining indicates what routes were taken by those who made it to the final. Well, from the table you can see that the men stayed together, whereas the women to a larger degree took different courses or different routes in those route choices. So it is possible that the route choices were so complex to find that the athletes did not manage to do a full evaluation, but rather took the first route choice that they found was executable. And then those who came from behind, they simply chose to follow for the same reason. So we may look for less complex route choices in future elimination routes and finals of knockout sprints. But the complexity in execution was really fine here. Some athletes made mistakes, but most athletes found the right routes. The final leg for this presentation is once again the last leg of the knockout sprint final. The leg is in an area that was well known for the athletes from the semi-final, but the artificial barriers were now in new places, creating new route choices. In the bottom is control number 9, in the top control 10, which is the second last control. Well, for the last time in this presentation, take a look and decide what you would do. In this case, we have 3 different route choices. We have green going left from the control, going this direction here, going this way up to the control. Then you have blue and red that are similar. The only difference is how will you leave the control. Blue going through these really narrow alleys towards this open square and then going this way to the control. Red taking a easier route when it comes to running, going like this, also slightly longer, going towards the control up here. As you can see, the 3 route choices, they are quite equal in length. So once again, it was more about deciding than what to decide. The table shows what routes were actually chosen, and the underlining shows what routes were taken by the winner. In the men's final, gold and silver was won on the green route. In the women's final, Tove Alexanderson was far ahead on the red route, but silver and bronze was won by the two only ones who took the blue route choice. So, in both finals, the route choice is taken and the execution of it on this leg seems to have been decisive for the distribution of the medals. Thus, the leg served its purpose, both in terms of having a suitable complexity in route choices as well as in execution. Now, let us wrap up this talk about sprint courses in 2022 with a few final remarks. Well, first of all, this presentation does not give final directions as to what is right and what is wrong. Too many factors are involved in course setting in order to make a fair evaluation and clear guidance. But hopefully you have been inspired about what considerations to make when you are involved in future sprint course setting. One tendency can be noted. In almost all high-level event sprints in 2022, artificial barriers were used to increase complexity in the route choices. The tendency towards creating complex route choices with use of barriers in high-level events is recognized by the athletes. It's a tendency we will also see in future big events. The three different sprint formats are different from a course setting perspective. High complexity in mass start formats increase the risk of following. And finally, the knockout sprint is still a young format. We will get more experience in the coming years. As always, you will be able to get more guidance about sprint course setting by looking at the webpage of the International Orienteering Federation. There you can find the IOF rules that has the appendix number 6, which hold the basic characteristics for all the orienteering formats, of course then also the 3 sprint formats. You can also there find the IOF course planning guideline for sprint competition that mentions the principles that needs to be taken into account to plan great sprint courses. And now is the time to say thank you to the contributors for the photos in this presentation, William Hollowell, Kjell Sønniksen, Susanna Lucier, and others. And it's also time to say thank you for your patience in listening to this presentation. And now we close the presentation. And if you participate in the Event Adviser Seminar, now we open for questions.